Do you ever feel that there's a relentless voice in your head that's constantly saying to you, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I can't cope? It feels like it's actually the truth. It feels completely real. And this is what we call in psychology cognitive fusion. Today, I'm going to talk to you about how our mental health is affected by fusion, how language affects our mental health. I'm going to talk to you today about how we can move from fusion into defusion and create some defusion strategies for us. Good mental health is about your behavior, it's about what you do, and our actions, our behavior actually seriously affect our mental health. When I don't press the right part of the presentation, if you're in good mental health, you make the most of your life, you can cope with life, you can interact properly in terms of your family, in terms of your work and your community. And there's this term called bounce back ability. Bounce back ability is actually about your ability to respond to an adverse experience. Everybody has adverse experiences. It's just a case of whether you have the resources to be able to work with those experiences or whether that's overwhelming because you don't have the resources. So a lot of people will go through life telling you about how bad their lives are because of things that have happened to them. That's actually not really to do with the event. It's actually to do with what resources they have around that particular event. Okay, so psychological flexibility is the ability to contact the present moment more fully as a conscious human being and to change or persist in behavior when doing so serves valued ends. Essentially, what we mean by that is even whenever things are concerning, you're actually making a choice around your behavior because it's better for the values that you hold in the longer term and in the bigger picture. Human suffering is actually quite considerably about the linguistic ability we have. Your discomfort is actually a massive part of your discomfort is actually about your ability to use language. And so there's a longer story here, but to cut down the story, imagine that there's a man who is on a Friday evening, his wife's away, and there's a snowstorm outside and it's blowing an absolute hooligan, and outside there's a gate banging in the wind. And the man who's just had an argument with his 13-year-old teenage daughter decides he's going to go out and shut the gate. And as he opens the door and goes out into the snow, the dog bounces out after him. And when he gets back from making the gate sound and he comes back to the house, because of the argument, the 13-year-old teenage daughter has locked him out of the house. So he actually goes through a whole load of emotional situation at that time. He actually goes through a whole lot of behavioral situation at that time, which is a bit of a longer conversation. But think about whenever the aftermath comes. The daughter kind of lets him into the house. The daughter lets him get to a point whereby, after he's been banging on the door for a while and probably threatening her, she eventually lets him into the house. He is unlikely to turn around and go, "Oh, thank you. I feel so much better." The question is, when he gets to the next day, 24 hours later, and his wife comes home from the trip she's been on, and she turns around and says, "How was your weekend? How was your Friday night?" Is he going to say, "Ah, it's lovely. Your daughter's lovely"? He's much more likely to say, "Your daughter," and to relive the story. And when he relives the story, he's actually going to have the same emotional connection to the story as if he was living it for the first time. And so our ability to use language, which gives us our ability to tell stories, also gives us our ability to connect to emotion through language. And when we can connect to emotion through language, we actually put ourselves into discomfort simply because of our connections to arbitrary things. The question is, if you think about the dog, when the 13-year-old daughter finally lets him into the house, the dog comes in, shakes himself off, finds a drink, finds something to eat, and goes and lies by the fire. The dog actually snuggles up to her and says, "Thank you for letting me through the door." The dog doesn't hold that emotional negativity in the same way as a human will, because the dog doesn't have the ability to process language the way a human being will. So our ability to process language causes us to have discomfort that we actually don't need, and we hold an awful lot of that. So if we're thinking about fusion, fusion is essentially about the fact that we are fused with belief systems. And so quite often we would say your assumption dictates your behavior. But your fusion with the assumption in the first place means that the neural pathway that you have leads to a reaction whereby you will react to something very quickly without taking a breath, taking that gap. People tend not to have a gap between stimulus and response. And psychological flexibility gives you the ability to take a breath and create a gap and think, do I really need to react in that way? Is this really a slight on me? Is this really about me? And so fusion, if we think about these three particular items, I am fused with the concept that I am a man. And that, in terms of my mental health, doesn't cause me any issues because that works well for me. But if I was fused with the fact that I was actually in the wrong body, that could cause serious mental health issues to me. And a lot of people end up fused with a role, with a belief system around a role. So, for example, I haven't been a police officer, but whenever we introduce ourselves to people, people automatically say, well, what do you do? And then you tell them the role you have, the job title you have. And as soon as you turn around and say, I'm an accountant, people make assumptions about that on a daily basis. When I turn around and say I'm a behavior analyst, people automatically start to think, oh, I'm analyzing their behavior. And so we're fused with a role, and we tend to be fused with that. And in terms of that affecting our mental health, if I am a police officer and I end up a certain age, 35 or 40 years old, and I've been doing it for a long time, and then I end up having to retire because I'm injured, or I end up being tied to a desk and I can't do the role in its full potential because I'm actually injured, my fusion with that role can cause me some discomfort because I'm actually not able to say I'm a full police officer anymore, or I'm not able to say I'm a police officer at all anymore. And this is one of the reasons why there are an awful lot of people who get to the point of retirement, and they get to the point of retirement wanting to think they're going to retire and have a fantastically wonderful life. And when they get to that point of retirement, they can't say, I am a doctor, I am a dentist anymore. And a lot of people end up dead 6 months later. And we think one of the reasons that's connected to that is their fusion with the role and their belief system around that, and not being able to say that they are that person anymore. I Can't Write Essays is actually to do with me. And it's highlighting about the fact that one event can make a huge difference in somebody's life. I was 11 years old, and there was a particular head teacher who I respected and taught me some things I hold to this day. And this particular head teacher I had been made by somebody anyway, the editor of the newsletter. And at Halloween, the newsletter came out. And I took the newsletter and I took it to the head teacher and I said, look, my name's at the bottom of that, but I didn't write any of that because I had written and submitted my article as the editor. But the words on that particular page, on the front page, were not mine. So I turned around and I said this to the teacher, and the teacher turned around and said, yes, but you're not very good at that, are you? And because he said you're not very good at that, I have spent my entire life believing that I am not very good at writing essays. Now that's been proven, or disproven, many, many times. I actually never got an A in school. However, I have done well in some academia since that point. And so my ability to write essays, while I have got good marks in those things, I've never got over the fact that I'm not very good at it. And that decision, or that belief system, that fusion, has actually led me to make choices in my life around academia. So, for example, I have specifically chosen to never do a qualification that would involve writing a dissertation, because as far as I'm concerned, I am no good at that. And that's just a fusion. And I could get over that, and it has been proven many times incorrect, but that's a fusion which I'm fused with. And your fusion creates this stuff. Now, we all have this advisor in our head, and some of the people in this call have heard me talk about your advisor before, and your advisor is constantly talking to you, and it tends to be negative in nature, and we know that it tends to be negative in nature because it's an evolutionary imperative that it's negative. It will keep you alive, it will make sure that you're safe and jump out of the way of the bus. However, all that gossip around things like we know that there's a snake by the tree gets spread among the tribe because it keeps everybody safe. And that negativity is something whereby the people who survive are the people who were careful. And then that advisor ends up being replicated with another human being who has an advisor which kept them safe. And generations and generations and generations later, we have an advisor which is incredibly nervous about everything around us all the time. And yet we don't have a tiger by the lake to look out for. We don't have that anymore. So it will get you to jump out of the way of the bus. But the problem is it's constantly talking to you. And it's constantly talking to you in a way which is actually not very positive if you believe it to be real. So one of the things we need to do is we need to take the fusion that the advisor is constantly talking to us and start to realize the advisor isn't real. So how do we do that? So I am going to create a list of questions here. And what we do is we get a group of people, and we get a group of people to, on their phones, state which of these they actually find most common in their heads in any given moment. And then once they've chosen the one that is the most common, they then choose the second most common, etc., and the third most common, etc. And you essentially rate these in a rank order. Now, the next slide will actually show you, I've done this with many hundreds of people. And the next slide shows you a group which is 42 people. I say the next slide, but it didn't want to respond. So that's a group of 42 people. You can see in the bottom right there, 42 people have actually responded to that. And that was me physically in the room with them. But it's a very common thing that comes up here. Now, the reason number 2 came up about me, about them saying in their heads they hear I'm too fat, maybe because that's something I actually talk about when I'm setting this situation up, generally, as a phrase I hear in my head. But the other top, the out of the top 4 there, out of the top 5, the most common ones that come up every single time, and usually I'm doing this with a group of say 12 people or 15 people. This is a particularly big group. I've done it with 60. But the one that comes up, or the 3 that come up most closest to the top almost every single time, are I'm not good enough, I can't cope, and I'm not worthy. And you have a whole lot of people who are sitting next to their counterpart, their colleague, in a room, and they actually are thinking, I've seen your Instagram, I've seen your Facebook, I know you're having a wonderful life. And then they realize that actually everybody in the room's top thing they hear in their head is I'm not good enough. And that's quite an eye-opening event for some people. But the main issue here is that the advisor is not real. And people who believe the advisor is real may be setting themselves up into a mental health crisis in the longer term. So how do we actually work with the fusion? How do we create some defusion? How do we start to distance ourselves from a belief system that's constantly saying negative things to us? So if you were to pick a negative thought, and I'm going to ask you to pick a negative thought that's been bothering you, something short and sharp, and we're going to do a little bit of work on that. And so, for example, I am incompetent. And while I'm doing these slides and I'm just doing this intro, I want you to actually think about some thought you hear that is constantly talking to you and constantly putting you down, that's quite short and sharp, that we can work with for this particular exercise. The first thing we're going to do is you're going to start saying to yourself, and actually, by the way, this works better if you say it out loud so that your own ears can hear you do it. But we're going to say to ourselves, I am having the thought that, and in our case, in this particular example, it would be, I am having the thought that I am incompetent. Now, just for a moment, take the thing that you've been thinking of and see if you can think, I am having the thought that. And if you've first thought about how you've connected to it, how it feels, I'm having the thought that I'm incompetent. Well, what if it starts with, I'm a bad person, I'm not very good, I'm not very lovable? If it's something like I'm a bad person, how does it feel? How does it sit with you? What actually happens in the sensations in your body? And then when you switch it and you turn around and you go, I am having the thought that I'm not a very good person. I'm having the thought that I'm a bad person. I'm having the thought that I'm incompetent. It starts to turn the statement into a slightly distanced thing, into slight distance. Gives you an object of scrutiny whereby it disrupts a little bit of its power and you can actually start to observe it, which is what we're going to come on to now. And so if you notice what's happened, you create a tiny bit of breathing space. It's not gone away. That's the main thing we're doing here, is we're not telling you that thoughts can be suppressed and shouldn't happen. But you've acknowledged it is a mental event that you've effectively noticed is happening, rather than actually a physical reality. And this voice in your head isn't actually physically real. And the next stage is we're going to start to add distancing to this process. And the way we add distancing to this process is we're going to go, I notice that I'm having the thought that I'm incompetent. So if you take your particular thing and you think about how it actually feels, and you actually try going, I notice that I'm having the thought that I'm a bad person. I notice that I'm having the thought that should give you a little bit of relief, a little bit of distancing, a little bit of less overwhelm, a little bit of easier to settle with. And this, by adding the I notice, changes you into an observer. You're no longer an incompetent person, you're a person who notices that the thought is passing through your consciousness. And so you actually have the ability to go, oh, that's an interesting thought. I'll just let that one slide. As opposed to going, oh, I am a bad person. Because the I am is a fusion. Noticing that there is someone saying that gives you the distancing of the observer, and that helps you to defuse yourself from those thoughts. So when you're actually having these things happen in the real world, a lot of the time you will find when you start that there's no gap between stimulus and response. You get a thought, you get an overwhelm, something from a decade ago pulls itself out of your memory, and you suddenly remember standing in front of a group of people and you said something that was embarrassing, and you get all that overwhelm again. Take a breath, create a gap between stimulus and response where you start to go, I notice I'm having the thought that I was embarrassed about that. Because one of the things I can guarantee is if you find all those people and you had a conversation with them a decade or two later and you said, do you remember when I said that thing? They won't remember. They have no idea it happened, but it's eating you up years and years later. So, we've talked about cognitive fusion, treating thoughts as literal truths. I am a bad person. We've talked about defusion, which is the process of creating distance from thoughts and seeing them as events rather than reality, witnessing them, which is the metacognition, which is thinking about your thinking, the ability to stand back and watch your mind at work and recognize, oh, that's an interesting thought. And I do this live in front of groups on a regular basis now, where I have an emotional event happen to me and I just pause and I very out loud turn around and go, I'm finding it really upsetting talking about that. And by labeling the emotion and noticing that I'm feeling upset, I notice I'm starting to get upset talking about that. I'm distancing myself from it, and within 5 or 6 seconds, on a different video, we'll talk about the neuroscience parts of the brain, It activates the correct part of the brain to help me to diffuse from that and to help me to de-escalate, and I actually settle. And that's a skill set. If you get good at it, it's going to change your life. If you want to be in a situation where you're not railroaded by your brain, if you want to get to the point where you get a handle on all these things that are actually happening to you, so you're not being bullied by your brain on a regular basis, come and join our community where we talk about these things. And Psychological Flexibility has hundreds of these kind of exercises where you can actually help yourself to move forward and create a higher quality of life. See you in the community.